Hey, Aaron Rabinowitz here for RedGiantTV.com. In this video tutorial, designer Harry Frank joins us to break down how he created some of the motion graphics for the TV Land Prime kickoff. He'll be using Trapcode Particular to create this cool effect, and then he'll dive into Adobe Illustrator and Maxon Cinema 4D to show you how to incorporate this into a full design project. Take it away, Harry.
Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant Software here. In this episode of RGTV, I'd like to show you a technique that I affectionately call the particular shooters, for lack of a better name. This works well as a background or embellishing camera moves that move along the z-axis, sort of this tunnel effect. I suppose it could also double as the Star Wars jump to light speed effect. But this is entirely Trapcode Particular, and I'd like to show you how to create this. So let's jump to a new comp. I'll work at 720 by 405, create a new solid for our shooters, and we'll apply Trapcode Particular. We'll create a new camera here too. So the basics of this effect are that we have a distant emitter that is shooting particles toward the camera, and those are creating a trail using the aux system. So first, let's move this off in the distance by pushing the Z position out to about 3500. We need this to be directional. And if you've used directional emitters before in particular, you know that by default, they actually sort of shoot away from the camera. So I need to flip this around, so I'm going to go into the X rotation and dial in 180. And let's go back to our camera view. I can just tap the escape key. And it's way off in the distance. So we need a way to get these particles a lot closer to the camera as they emit. And a velocity of 100 is actually quite slow for this effect. We really need to crank it up. I'm going to dial in 2000 for now. We'll see how that works. Now, I tend to use a box emitter rather than a point emitter. So right now we're emitting from a single point in space way off in the distance. I'm going to select box emitter and just size it up a little bit, maybe 500 by 500 in X and Y. Now that we've got a box and we also have a directional spread that defaults to 20, any of these particles can shoot in any sort of angle. And I don't really want this. I want a very straight kind of look. So I'm going to set the directional spread down to 0. In fact, I'm going to speed these up even more. Let's set this to 2500. And let's add some color to the particles. So I'm going to go into the particle section and go to the color. We'll set the color randomly from a gradient, and we'll go in here, select the color gradient, and I'll just pick this default map right here. Maybe I'll pull out some of the pink and just use kind of a yellow to red to purple look. And next, really what I need to do is have these particles emit particles themselves. Now, I've covered the aux system in prior episodes of RGTV, and I really want to stress how powerful the aux system is, because basically it is a secondary set of emitters inside our primary emitter. So we've got our emitter here that's emitting particles from a box shape way off in the distance. But from each of these individual particles, we can have all of those become emitters. And that's exactly what the aux system is. So let's jump into the aux system here, and we'll have these particles emit continuously. We can also have them emit at something called a bounce event, but that's not what we want. We just want these particles to be continuously shooting particles. Now, you'll notice as the primary particles are moving, you can see they're moving quite quickly, the aux particles are relatively static. This is because in the control from main particles, the inherent velocity setting is 0. So as these particles are born from the main particles, they pretty much stay exactly where they are. There's no momentum or inherited velocity. So if I start turning this up closer to 100, but not exactly 100, because you notice if I set this to 100, they're all moving at the exact same speed. So I need to have it relatively high, but not too high. So this value here, this inherent velocity, is more or less going to define the length of the tail behind the main particle. Now we can smooth it out by adding more particles, but really we want to start with this length of the kind of the comet tail. We're getting there. We got kind of a, well, disco look going on right now, which might be useful. But let's smooth this out. As a main particle moves by the camera, it has this trail. The trail is formed by particles emitted by the main particle. Right now we are emitting 10 particles per second in the aux system. So if I emit more and more particles from the main particle, we'll start to see the tail smooth itself out. It's a little bit harsh right now, but we can fix that. Typically, I go into the opacity and lower the overall opacity of the aux system. Now, the aux system is carrying its own set of color. It's this default rainbow spectrum. This is because they have their own color map right now. So if I go into color over life, we have the default settings right here. I can choose different color maps for them. But overall, if I'd like to have each one of these streaks be a different color, what I want to have happen is the aux system particles should inherit the color from the main particle. Because remember, I had the particles choose the color randomly from a map. So now what I can do is go in and tell the particles to inherit the color. So right here, color from main, this is a percentage, so I can have them absorb 100% of that original color. And now we're starting to see our shooters come together. I'm going to add a little bit of a fade out over time, so let's go into the opacity over life. I'll just select this this linear curve right here. Now we're getting pretty close. Now if you'd like the trademark Harry Frank gray machine look, let's kick our project up to 32-bit. So I'm just holding down Alt or Option and clicking on the color depth right down here. And we're going to go into our effect here and layer on top of that the glow effect. I'm a huge fan of rendering glow at 32 bits per channel. It gets this really nice, rich, deep kind of feel. Let's expand out the radius, and the intensity doesn't need to be very high at all. Or if it is a little bit too harsh, we can actually go into the original opacity of the aux particles and knock it down even more. That heavy 32-bit glow doesn't need a whole lot of opacity to start with. So, you know, somewhere below 10 seems to really work pretty well. And there you have it. Just one more way to use Trapcode Particular, my absolute #1 favorite plugin. You can create backgrounds, embellishment effects, that kind of thing. So let me show you this shooter's effect in production and sort of a complete workflow. So inspired from that TV Land spot, I've put together a logo assembly of the Red Giant logo. So you can see it's sort of broken into cubes. It has a sort of long extrusion effect, and everything comes together nicely at the 3-second mark as one complete object. I actually started this in Illustrator. So I went to my grids, showed a grid, and imported my logo and started slicing along the grid. Now, as I was doing this, I was sort of cheating the letters back and forth, aligning them on better spots of the grid so that letters had a nice, even set of breakpoints rather than just randomly falling anywhere on the characters. And I did this using the knife tool under the buried under the eraser tool. Now there's eraser, scissors, and knife. If we pull up the knife tool and we have any sort of object in here, if I use the knife tool, we can go through and slice it up like so. But I can also hold down the Shift key to get a little bit more of a straight cut. And if I hold down Alt, I will get a to B point rather than a Bezier curve that we can draw. So if we put those two together, Alt, Option, and Shift, or I should say Alt or Option, depending on your platform, and the Shift button, we can get a completely straight cut along a grid. And that's exactly what I did to break this logo up and have detailed control over the breakpoints of the logo. So let me create a new scene here in Cinema 4D. If I go to merge that file in, we can see that I've got my nice little logo here. Let's create a camera inside Cinema 4D and look through the camera. And let me frame up the logo all nicely. Zoom back just a little bit using the scroll wheel. And in fact, I can just select this object and hit O to frame it completely within my viewport. And I'll back off just to get it right inside title safe. This is where I want my camera to land. So right at 3 seconds, I'll set a keyframe there. And then at 0, I want to zoom in from the logo itself. In fact, I'm going to start right at this centerpiece right here. I can even select that object itself and hit O to frame it. Now what I need to do is rotate my camera, because as you can see, my aspect ratio and the size of the piece here, the aspect of the piece, don't quite line up. In fact, this will make a nice little twist in the camera if I go through and add a 90-degree twist from the starting point. So now I can select this piece, hit O, that will frame it nicely in my viewport, and select the camera and hit F9. So now I've got a twist and a move out like that, and it lands nicely. Now, with this object selected, if I open this up, you can see this is a lot of different paths, 63 different paths that go together and make up this individual logo. But I can select this one object here. I'll hold down Alt or Option and go up to Extrude NURBS. This will put that group of objects underneath the Extrude NURBS. And once I select the Extrude NURBS, go under Object, select the hierarchical switch, all in the 63 individual pieces will extrude on their own, and I can move them individually as extruded objects. So to create this effect, what I want is well, a very long extrusion, but I don't want the extrusion at the very end of the animation. So I'm going to animate that over time. That's the movement function, basically the extrude depth of the extrude NURBS. So I'll control click right here to set a keyframe for that movement. 20 meters is pretty good for the ending, but at the beginning, I want a very long extrusion. So I'll set this to 800 meters and hit play again. You can see we have that long extrusion depth out there. And then as it settles back in, we have that narrow extrusion depth. In fact, I'm going to set this to a total length of 120, just so we have a little bit of a second to pause there at the end. So from here, all I need to do are animate the individual positions of the pieces in here. In fact, let me close up the layer browser here to get a little bit more room. And all I need to do is kind of give myself a little bit of a random distribution of where these paths fall. And this is a little bit time consuming, so I'm not going to do the whole thing on camera. But basically, if I take each one of these, let's see if I park my camera right about here. So if I select these two components and move them forward, you can see that I get a nice extrusion that can sort of shoot by the camera. We can see our camera position right there. So over time, I can again, animate the position of these components and make sure they all end up back at 0. So actually, before I do anything, let me undo that. I need to select all these components. In fact, I can just select the parent, go under Edit, select Children. Now I have all 63 components selected. Let's go to the 90 frame mark, and I'll set a keyframe for that Z position, because that's where we want them all to end up. And then let me back up the camera a little bit. And let's just start moving these things around. I'm just going to do it a little bit randomly, and we can always fine-tune as things go along. In fact, I don't need to select all of them. Let's just select a few components. Let's grab maybe a few of these and a few of these on the side. So let me switch over to the partially finished cake in the oven. Really, all I did was go through and adjust the animation of all those individual pieces with regard to the camera, and just kind of, start mostly at the center, and then they kind of ripple out from there. So as you can see from the top, it does exactly what I said, where all the pieces are moving, and there's a long extrusion, and everything comes back together right at the 90th frame. So if I look through the camera here, we start like this, and we pull out, and everything assembles together. Now from here, I just need to add some texture to this, so let's create a new material. I'll drop it on our logo extrusion here. I'm going to go into the luminance channel, add a Fresnel texture, and we'll just have this to be kind of like a gray to white. And in my render settings, I can go into Effect, I'll select Ambient Occlusion, and let's just kind of zoom in here and show what this is looking like so far. I'll just turn on a live preview render here. So we've got a nice kind of clean ambient occlusion look. I'll take the original color out, actually. So we just have the Fresnel and the ambient occlusion render. Now in After Effects, I'd like to go in and place some video on this face right here. Now I can't actually select this face because it's an extrude NURBS using the live Illustrator paths that I created. So I'm just going to create a duplicate of this, and we'll call this the matte object. I'm going to turn off these layers up here. In fact, I'll just turn them all off, and let's turn off the extrude NURBS for this. So I just want to select this one object right here, and I only want this one object. So let me go up to View, scroll to First Active, and this will show me that selected path, number 59 here. So let me just delete all the rest of these paths here. So I'll just select all of them using the Shift key, and that was path number 59. So I'll unselect that one and hit delete. Now I can just extrude that one separately, and this can be a nice reference object for my video in After Effects. In fact, in this object here, I want to reset the axis center. So I'm going to go into the axis center here, and I want to push it to one of the corners here, right there in the upper left. And I'm going to add a tag under Cinema 4D tags, external compositing. Basically, it will tell this object and this location to come through in After Effects relative to the camera and in the exact 3D space that I need it to be to align with the 3D render. I also need to render a matte of this so that I can have the video actually be cropped to this exact shape. Okay, so it's time to render this out and get it into After Effects. I've opened up my final project here just so it has all my render settings ready to go, and I'll show you exactly what I've got. One last thing I need to do on this matte object here is select it, go to Tags, and apply a compositing tag. This gives me access to an option called the Object Buffer. And really, all this is a set of buffers that allow me to take an object as it is visible to the camera and render a matte of that image. If I apply this compositing tag and enable an object buffer, in my render settings, I can output an object buffer from 1 to 12, and it'll render a matte image of any of those objects that are a part of object buffer number 1, and basically just render a Luma-based pass of those objects. So in other words, I can use this as perhaps a Luma matte in After Effects to crop my video to fit exactly on this object. And that's what I'm going to do. I also want to add RGBA to my rendering because obviously I want to see the finished product of the logo itself. I need to define where I'm rendering to. So I've simply defined a folder that I put all my image sequences in for any given project. I'm calling this creatively a 3D logo. So as it renders these two passes, it'll render 3D logo RGBA image, and it'll render 3D logo object buffer number 1, or object 1. Now, normally I'd be able to output these simultaneously, but as I mentioned, the object buffer renders things as they are visible to the camera. Right now, I have this matte object in the exact same space as the logo object. And if I hit render right now, it's actually not going to render the object buffer because it's essentially not visible to the camera. They're in the exact same place. Now I could cheat it and move it 1 pixel closer to the camera or whatever, but then that makes my object actually incorrect. So really, I just need to do 2 separate passes here. So I can just turn this matte object off so it's not even visible, and just uncheck object buffer and just render the RGBA image. Now, before I hit render, I'm going to turn the ambient occlusion back on. And if I hit Shift R to render this, it's going to go through frame by frame and start rendering my animation. Once that finishes rendering, I can uncheck the RGBA image and go into object buffer. And being that I've got this object buffer only visible and not turned on at the same time with the logo so that they occupy the same space, I can just go in and render out just that object buffer. So if I hit Shift R again, we'll see, actually it's going to overwrite my old render, but that's fine. If I hit yes, and under my channels here, I'm viewing just the object buffer, and we can see that we're just outputting a matte version of that object. And this goes actually quite quickly. Now, one more thing I want to do, let me turn back on the RGBA image, and let's turn this logo back on so we've got everything turned on in our scene. I want to save out this whole project as a compositing project file, which Cinema 4D does an awesome job at. So if I want to save to After Effects using the 3D data, I'm going to output this AEC file. It's a After Effects compositing file, and I'll put this in my After Effects projects folder. I'll overwrite the old one that I've got in there. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to After Effects, and I'll import just by double-clicking in the project window. And I want to import that AEC file that I created. It's going to import this as a Cinema 4D composition and create a folder. If I open this up, we'll see the camera data is in there as well as the exact location of that path. Remember, that was path number 59. It imports that special pass, that object buffer pass as well. So if I drop that in there, we can see that the corners are actually exactly aligned. I'm going to go in and rotate this into the orientation that I want. In fact, there's no actual animation going on with this. I'll eliminate the keyframes and just knock this over by 90 degrees. Now, because I did this in two separate passes, I actually ended up not getting that RGB pass imported. So this is actually a good thing to know how to do. I just need to go back into that sequence folder, and you'll see that I've got my two separate passes in here. I got 3D logo object 1, that's the object buffer, and then I also have 3D logo RGBA. So if I select that, make sure this is selected as a TIFF sequence and import that in. I do want to import the alpha channel as pre-multiplied. Let's just put this down in here with this separate pass. So if I drag this down in here, let me turn off this matte, because it's not an alpha channel, it's just a black and white matte. So we've got my camera, I've got my null object exactly where I want the video to go, and I also have a matte object of exactly where that video needs to be cropped to be on the face of that portion of the G. And I also have my awesome shooters that I'll drop in there. So I'm going to select all this stuff. I'll just copy it and paste it into my composition here. All right, let's just crop this up right here. Now you can see that the location of my particles and my camera are not quite in agreement here. So I'm going to drag this probably close to something like 0 and 0. And that actually seems to line up pretty good. Being 0 and 0 is going to be the point of origin of Cinema 4D. And that was the exact center point of my Cinema 4D world. So it actually seems to line up pretty well. But, you know, if we need to fine tune it, we can just go in here to our position XY and adjust those. So let me drop some video onto the face of that object. Let's grab something from a previous project that I worked on for RGTV. So I've got some video. I'm going to select this object right here. So this is the exact place where I want my video to be. So I'm simply going to Option or Alt, drag, and replace with that selected. And it's going to replace that null object with my video. Now, by default, this ends up with an opacity of 0, so I need to set that to the correct opacity. and I need to scale it and rotate it so it's actually in the right orientation and space. It's quite a bit too large, so let's size it way down. In fact, let's get right to the very beginning here. So actually, the orientation is correct, so I just need to scale this down, given that this is a pretty high resolution piece of video. Let's scale it down. Now, I have 2 keyframes here from Cinema 4D, but it always does that by default. There's no actual movement of this object, so I can kind of shimmy it around here to center up the actor right in the center, the actress. Now, here's where the object buffer comes in, so I can pull up object number 1, put that right above, go to my track matte settings, and set this to Luma Matte from that render. So now I've got my video completely aligned and locked in 3D space, and at some point here, I'm going to need to fade it out. So let's give myself a little bit more room here. Go to my Music Viz, and somewhere right about here, I'll start fading it out. So I'll just set a keyframe for the opacity and drop that down to 0. Let's go back to my switches here, set that to 0. Because Particular is a full 3D particle system, integrates with the camera movement. The camera, even though it came from Cinema 4D, locks right with Particular and integrates really, really well. And I think it's one of those things that really helped out with this logo animation. So just a couple of finishing touches here. I do have an adjustment layer. This is just a solid, and I've got a blur on here, just a fast blur, and I can put this on top and fade this back in with the rest of my project. Just adds a little bit of diffusion, or as you can see, it's called the diffuse layer. And I use this a lot, using perhaps an overlay or hard light blending mode, depending on the effect you're looking for. But it adds just a nice sort of finishing touch to everything. One additional trick, with this finished render, I'm going to duplicate this. With it selected, I'll go to Effect and Stylize, and we'll select Find Edges. I'm going to invert that, so I just have black and white, mostly black, and then white highlights. I'm going to crush some of those additional noisy areas out, so I just have mostly the edges. I need to set this to screen, so it'll screen out the rest of the black, but then I'm going to add a little bit of glow to this as well. In fact, before I add that glow, I'm going to drop some tritone on this so I can colorize it just a little bit. We'll give a kind of a bluish cast to this right here, and a little teal kind of look. And then let's go in, add stylize, and glow. Again, make sure we're working at 32 bits per channel, get a nice heavy glow. And we'll see how this mixes back in with the original. I'm going to lighten up the black areas of this. And then on the final product, I'm going to add just a bit of a blur. So it adds a little bit more of that kind of retro sheen. This is a really nice effect that I've been doing a lot lately on 3D renders. I'm going to pull back this diffuse just a little bit because this is making it kind of harsh. But it's a nice way to get that sort of, it's almost like a Tron kind of look on the edges. And adding that tritone effect in there allows you to kind of tweak and customize the color mapping of this. Perhaps we want a little bit of yellow hint in the highlights and maybe darken the midtones. So there you have it. Now, if you're only using After Effects, hopefully you picked up some great tips on using Particular to create background images or embellishment type images. And if you are working in 3D or even thinking about working in 3D, hopefully you picked up some great workflow tips on how to integrate After Effects, Particular, and your 3D package. In this case, I was using Cinema 4D, which is a favorite of mine. Thanks so much for watching.
Thanks, Harry. If you've enjoyed this tutorial, you can check out Harry's work, including the TV Land spot, at his website, graymachine.com. Harry is arguably one of the most knowledgeable people on the planet when it comes to Trapcode Particular, and he's also overseeing most of the art and design these days here at Red Giant. If you're looking to jump into real 3D for motion graphics, you should definitely check out Cinema 4D at maxon.net. And don't forget, you can always download a trial of Trapcode Particular at redgiantsoftware.com. Once again, I'm Aaron Rabinowitz for redgianttv.com. See you next time.